The fluorescent lights in the Meridian Logistics building had this specific hum, a frequency that sat right behind your teeth. I'd worked under those lights for 6 years, and I'd learned to ignore them the way you learn to ignore a scar on your own face. But that Thursday morning, the hum felt different. Everything felt different. The air had a weight to it, like the building itself was holding its breath. I was at my desk on the 4th floor, pretending to review a cargo manifest for a pharmaceutical shipment bound for Munich, when Gerald Erskine appeared at my cubicle entrance. Gerald was my boss, not the CEO, not some visionary. He was a middle management operations director with thinning hair and a collection of ties that hadn't been fashionable in any known decade. He was the kind of man who sent emails at 5:47 a.m. to prove he was already working. The kind who'd correct your grammar in a group thread and call it mentorship. I neither liked nor disliked Gerald. He was furniture. He was the hum in the lights. But that morning, Gerald Erskine looked like a man who'd swallowed a secret too large for his body. "Connor, my office. Now." No pleasantries. No preamble about the Munich manifest. He turned and walked back down the corridor, and I noticed his left hand was trembling. Gerald's hands never trembled. Gerald's hands were the steadiest thing about him. He used to joke about it. Said he'd missed his calling as a surgeon. I stood up and followed him. My colleague Priya Chandrasekaran glanced up from her monitor 2 cubicles over and raised an eyebrow. I shrugged. She went back to typing. That was the last ordinary exchange I ever had with another human being inside that building. Gerald's office was at the end of the hall, a glass-walled rectangle that overlooked the parking lot, and beyond it, the gray sprawl of industrial Cheshire. When I stepped inside, he was already behind his desk, and I noticed he'd drawn the blinds, all of them. Every slat sealed. The room was lit only by his desk lamp. On the desk, centered like an altarpiece, was a black briefcase. Not a laptop bag, not a courier pouch. A hard-shell Samsonite with brass combination locks, the kind you'd see handcuffed to a wrist in a Cold War film. It looked wrong sitting on Gerald's cluttered desk, between his world's okayest manager mug and a framed photo of his twin daughters. "Sit down," he said. His voice was stripped of its usual self-importance. What remained was flat and direct, and that scared me more than anything he could have said. I sat. "Listen carefully, Connor. I need you to take this briefcase. I need you to leave this building within the hour and drive north. Don't go home. Don't call anyone. Don't stop until you reach the Arnside facility. You know the one, the overflow warehouse near Morecambe Bay." I knew the facility. I'd been there once for a stock audit. It was remote, barely staffed, surrounded by salt marshes and silence. "Gerald, what is this about?" He leaned forward. The lamp threw deep shadows across his face, turning his features angular, almost gaunt. "This briefcase was couriered to me at 4 this morning by someone from the Blackwell Group, our parent company. You've seen the name on the letterhead, but you've never met anyone from Blackwell, and that's by design. The briefcase is locked. The combination isn't mine to share. Someone at Arnside will meet you and open it." "What's inside it?" He held my gaze for 3 full seconds. "I don't know. And I mean that. I was told to choose someone I trust, someone methodical, someone who doesn't panic. I chose you." I almost laughed. Gerald Erskine trusted me. That was the most disorienting sentence I'd heard in years. "One warning came with it," he said. He placed both palms flat on the desk, steadying himself. "Whatever happens in the next 12 hours, do not open this briefcase yourself. No matter what you see, no matter what you hear on the radio. The contents are not for you to interpret. Just deliver it. What's going to happen in the next 12 hours? Gerald didn't answer. He looked at the window blinds as though something might press through them. I left Gerald's office carrying the briefcase in my right hand. It weighed more than it should have, maybe 4 kilograms, and the weight was unevenly distributed, as if whatever was inside had shifted during transit and settled wrong. The brass locks caught the corridor light and threw tiny gold reflections against the walls as I walked. Priya looked up again as I passed. "You're leaving? It's not even 10. "Gerald's sending me to Arnside. Stock issue." The lie came out smooth and tasteless, and Priya accepted it with a mild disinterest that defined our friendship. We were close in the way office colleagues become close. We knew each other's coffee orders, complained about the same parking situation, exchanged exactly one personal detail per week. She knew I had a younger brother named Liam. I knew she was training for a half marathon. That was the entire architecture of our bond. "Drive safe," she said. "Radio says there's something weird happening on the M6. Accident or something. Massive delays." "Thanks." I took the stairs instead of the lift because the briefcase made me feel conspicuous, like carrying it in an enclosed space with other people would invite questions I couldn't answer. The stairwell was empty. My footsteps echoed against the concrete in a way that made the building feel hollow, evacuated. On the second-floor landing, I paused and looked at the briefcase properly for the first time. The Samsonite shell was scuffed near the left hinge, and there was a small adhesive label on the underside, white, with a string of numbers printed in a font I didn't recognize. No barcode, no company logo, just 12 digits and a dash. I memorized the number without deciding to. That's the kind of thing my mind does, pattern recognition, automatic cataloging. Gerald was right about one thing. I don't panic. I organize. I file. I proceed. That quality had made me exceptional at logistics and mediocre at every relationship I'd ever attempted. My ex-girlfriend Diane once told me I processed emotions the way other people process tax returns thoroughly, belatedly, and with a sense of obligation rather than urgency. I reached the ground floor and pushed her through the fire exit into the car park. The morning was overcast, the sky a uniform gray that erased all depth and distance. My car was a dark blue Vauxhall Insignia, parked in the same spot I used every day, third row near the recycling bins. I placed the briefcase on the passenger seat, buckled it in an absurd gesture that felt instinctively correct, and started the engine. The radio came on mid-sentence, urging residents in the greater Manchester area to remain indoors. Emergency services are responding to multiple incidents across the city center. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a test of the emergency broadcast system. I sat motionless with my hand on the gear stick. The announcer's voice was controlled but thin, like a wire pulled taut. Behind her words, I could hear something a distant commotion in the broadcast studio itself. Muffled voices, a door slamming. Reports are coming in of widespread civil disturbance. Hospitals in Salford, Stockport, and central Manchester are reporting capacity overflows. Police have established cordons along the A56 and... The broadcast cut to dead air. Then static. Then a tone I'd never heard before. A long, sustained note that vibrated through the car's speakers like a dental drill pressed to bone. I switched the radio off. Manchester was 40 minutes south. Whatever was happening there, the M6 would carry me north, away from it. Gerald's instructions aligned with common sense for the first time in recorded history. I pulled out of the car park at 9:51 a.m. I remember the exact time because the dashboard clock was the last mundane object I ever looked at with an uncomplicated mind. After that moment, every object I encountered would carry secondary meaning: threat, utility, memory, regret. The first 10 minutes of the drive were normal. Traffic moved, signals worked. Other drivers existed in their sealed capsules of routine, heading to places that still mattered. A woman in a red Fiat changed lanes without indicating. And I felt the old familiar irritation, that tiny spark of righteous commuter anger. It was the last clean emotion I experienced. Then I reached the M6 junction, and the world changed its rules. The motorway wasn't congested in the way Priya's radio report had suggested. Congestion implies volume, density, movement arrested by its own abundance. This was different. Cars were stopped, not queued, but stopped, scattered across lanes at wrong angles, as if their drivers had simply ceased to participate in the concept of driving. Doors hung open on a white transit van in the middle lane. A silver Mercedes had mounted the central reservation, its front wheels suspended over the opposite carriageway. And between the vehicles, people were moving in ways that didn't correspond to any emergency protocol I'd ever been trained to recognize. A man in a high-visibility jacket was walking wrongward. He was progressing along the hard shoulder with a gait that looked rehearsed by someone who'd had the concept of walking described to them, but had never actually seen it done. His arms didn't swing. His head was tilted at an angle that suggested his neck had lost interest in supporting it properly. He moved past a woman sitting on the tarmac beside an open car door, and she didn't look up. She was holding her forearm against her chest. And even from 50 meters away, I could see the dark stain spreading through her blouse. I stopped the car. Every rational system in my body told me to stop. Then a different system, older, deeper, installed in the architecture before logic arrived, told me to drive. Not around the obstacles, through whatever gap existed. Now. I mounted the hard shoulder and accelerated past the frozen tableau. In my peripheral vision, I saw the high-vis man turn toward the sound of my engine. His face was wrong. I don't mean injured, though it might have been. I mean compositionally wrong. The expression didn't map to any human state I could name. His mouth was open, but not in surprise or pain. It was open the way a door is open. Functionally, vacantly, an aperture with nothing behind it. I didn't stop. I kept the accelerator down and threaded between an abandoned lorry and the barrier, scraping the Vauxhall's left wing mirror clean off against the metal. The sound was terrible, a shriek of metal on metal, and I saw 3 more figures on the road, a head turned toward it, with that same mechanical responsiveness, that same absence of deliberation. Past the blockage, the motorway opened up. Empty lanes stretched north under the gray sky, and for 5 surreal minutes, I was the only car on the M6. Just me, the briefcase buckled into the passenger seat, and a radio that produced nothing but the long, sustained tone whenever I tried it. I drove at 110 miles per hour and felt nothing except the vibration of the engine and a growing coldness in my stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. At Junction 32, I saw the helicopter. It was Military A, Chinook, the kind with the twin rotors, flying low and fast across the motorway heading east. Then another behind it, then a third. They moved in formation with a purposefulness that confirmed what the radio had only implied. This wasn't an accident or a riot or a localized disturbance. This was an operation. The machinery of the state was already in motion, which meant the state already knew what was happening and had decided that telling the public clearly was less important than moving assets. I thought about Gerald Specifically, I thought about the timeline. He'd received the briefcase at 4 in the morning, 6 hours before the motorway became an abattoir of abandoned vehicles and people who'd forgotten how to be people. The Blackwell group had known. Gerald had known at least enough to be afraid. And he'd sent me north with something locked in brass and Samsonite, something important enough to warrant a courier in the dead of night and a chain of custody that bypassed every normal channel. I looked at the briefcase. The 12-digit number on the label stared back at me like an accusation. Don't open it. No matter what you see, no matter what you hear, I drove. The exit for Arnside was still 40 miles ahead. Between here and there, the world was rewriting itself in real time, and I was carrying a chapter I wasn't allowed to read. I left the motorway at Junction 35 because Junction 36 was on fire. Not metaphorically. The Carnforth interchange was burning. A petrol station had detonated near the roundabout, and a column of black smoke rose vertically in the still air like a signal to something I didn't want to think about. I took the earlier exit and found myself on a B-road cutting through farmland. The kind of narrow lane flanked by dry stone walls and hedgerows that made England feel ancient and indifferent to whatever modern catastrophe was unfolding on its motorways. For 3 miles, the road was empty. Sheep grazed in a field to my left, completely unbothered. A kestrel hovered above the verge, hunting. The normalcy was so aggressive, it felt hostile, as though the countryside was refusing to acknowledge what was happening 30 miles south. Then I came around a bend and found a car blocking the road. A green Land Rover Defender, parked diagonally across both lanes with its engine still running. Standing beside it was a woman in her mid-30s, tall with cropped dark hair and an expression of focused calculation. She was holding a shotgun broken open across her forearm, barrels pointing at the ground. Country protocol. Not threatening, but not unarmed. I stopped. She walked to my window. I lowered it halfway. "Where are you heading?" she asked. No greeting. Her accent was local Lancashire, educated, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd left for university and come back. Arnside. Roads blocked past Yealand. There's a pile-up at the railway crossing cars, a bus, people. You'll need to go through Silverdale and cut down the coast road. Are you police? She almost smiled. Veterinarian. Helen Marsh. I've got a practice in Yealand, Redmayne. She glanced at the road behind me. How bad is the motorway? Bad. Abandoned vehicles, people acting, I don't know how to describe it. Wrong. I know how to describe it, Helen said. She closed the shotgun with a clean snap. I've seen it in animals. 3 days ago, a farmer brought me a border collie that had been bitten by something in the night. Wouldn't eat, wouldn't respond to commands, just stood in the center of the examination room and stared at the wall. Then, about 6 hours in, it turned. Not rabid. I've seen rabies. This was different. The aggression wasn't frantic. It was directed, purposeful, like the dog had received new instructions. The word bitten sat between us like a dropped blade. You're telling me this is a disease, I said. I'm telling you I put that collie down and burned the body, and I reported it to DEFRA, and no one called me back. 3 days, no callback. Then this morning, my neighbor's son came home from Manchester at 6 a.m. with a wound on his neck and a fever that hit 41 degrees in an hour. His mother called me because the ambulance line was engaged. I went over. By the time I arrived, he was standing in the kitchen with his mother's blood on his hands, and she was on the floor. And she was still moving, Connor. She was still moving, but she wasn't Margaret anymore. Helen said my name as if she'd read it off a document. I realized she'd been looking at the briefcase since the beginning of our conversation. What's in the case? she asked. I don't know. Who sent you? My employer, a logistics company. The parent group is called Blackwell. Something shifted in Helen's face, a recognition she tried to mask and failed. Blackwell, she repeated. The pharmaceutical division. They fund half the veterinary research grants in the Northwest. They funded mine. What was your research? She looked at me the way you look at someone who's about to learn something irreversible. Transmissible neurological agents in mammalian populations. Prion adjacent. Behavioral modification post-infection. She paused. I published a paper 2 years ago about theoretical cross-species transmission vectors. Blackwell buried it, paid for the research, then made the results disappear. The briefcase suddenly felt like it was generating heat. Helen moved her defender to the verge, and I followed her through the back roads towards Silverdale. She drove ahead, and I stayed close, watching her brake lights navigate the curves with a competence that steadied something in me. Having a direction, having someone who knew the terrain, recalibrated my interior from raw alarm to functional focus. The village of Silverdale appeared after 10 minutes of winding lanes. It was small, a few hundred houses, a church, a pub called The Woodlands, a post office with a hand-painted sign. The kind of place that appeared on walking maps and in retirement fantasies. As we drove in, I noticed curtains drawn in nearly every window, and not a single person on the street. One front door was open, swinging slightly in the breeze, and I could see a hallway beyond it, coats on hooks, a shoe rack, a child's bicycle leaned against the wall. Domestic architecture preserved in amber while its inhabitants had vanished or hidden. Helen pulled over near the church and got out. I parked behind her and did the same, carrying the briefcase. She noticed. You don't leave it in the car, she said. Statement, not question. I was told not to let it out of my possession. By the same people who may have manufactured whatever's happening right now. I didn't have a response to that. She was right. And the implications were a corridor I wasn't ready to walk down. Helen led me to the church St. John's, a stone building that looked like it had been standing since before the concept of news existed. The door was heavy oak, unlocked. Inside, the nave was cool and dim, and sitting in the front pew was a man I initially mistook for a vicar. He was elderly, silver-haired, wearing a tweed jacket over a checked shirt. He turned when we entered, and his face showed relief, then suspicion, then a cautious neutrality that came from practice. Helen, who's this? Connor, I didn't get your surname. Birch, Connor Birch. Connor Birch, Helen repeated. He's heading to the Arnside facility, carrying something from Blackwell. The elderly man stood. He was tall, slightly stooped, with hands that were large and weathered. I'm Arthur Kay, retired GP. I've been the closest thing to medical authority this village has since Dr. Patel left for Kendall 3 years ago. He looked at the briefcase. Everyone's looking at that case today, aren't they? Apparently. Helen told me about Margaret Bowen, Arthur said. And his voice carried the weight of someone who'd known Margaret personally, who'd perhaps delivered her son, who existed in the web of rural relationships that turned neighbors into something closer to extended family. I went to the house after Helen left. Margaret was gone, walked out the back door into the fields. Her son was still in the kitchen. He came at me and I locked him in the pantry. He's still there as far as I know. And I need someone to tell me what to do about that. Because my medical training did not cover patients who bite through their own lips and don't seem to notice. The three of us stood in St. John's Church while dust motes drifted through stained glass light. And the silence outside, pressed against the windows, like a living thing. Arthur wanted answers. Helen wanted confirmation of a theory she'd been building for 2 years. I wanted to deliver a briefcase and return to a world where Gerald Erskine's worst quality was his email habits. None of us were going to get what we wanted. A sound broke the silence, distant but distinct. A car horn, sustained, coming from the direction of the coast road. Then it stopped. Then nothing. "How many people are in this village right now?" I asked. "Maybe 60 who didn't leave this morning," Arthur said. "Mostly elderly. A few families with young children. The Hendersons on Park Road, the Dawson twins. Lydia Chen and her daughter Grace. She's 11, smart as a whip, terrified out of her mind." "Where is everyone?" "In their houses. I told them to stay inside, doors locked. Don't answer for anyone you don't recognize." "That's good." "That's temporary," Arthur corrected. "Temporary and insufficient, and I know it." Within 2 hours, the population of our accidental coalition had grown to 9. Arthur conducted a quiet census, moving house to house with Helen while I stayed at the church with a briefcase and a growing sense of complicity. They returned with 5 additional survivors: James and Fiona Henderson, a married couple in their 50s who ran the village's only Lydia Chen, a software engineer who'd moved from London 2 years prior seeking quiet, bringing her daughter Grace, who stood behind her mother with the wide-eyed vigilance of a child who understood that adults were afraid and was cataloging that information for future reference, and Marcus Webb, a 23-year-old apprentice electrician who'd been installing a fuse box in the village hall when his phone lit up with messages from friends in Lancaster describing things he initially thought were jokes. Marcus was the most visibly frightened among us. His hands shook when he spoke, and he spoke in run-on sentences that tripped over themselves. "My mate Danny sent me a proper video, not fake people chasing people down Penny Street. And the ones doing the chasing weren't right. They were moving like their joints had extra hinges. And Danny's not answering his phone now. Hasn't for an hour. Marcus." Helen's voice was a clean incision through his spiraling. "We need the fuse box in the village hall working. Can you do that?" He blinked, nodded. Yeah, I can do that." Purpose as medicine. Helen understood something about crisis management that I was only beginning to learn. People didn't need comfort. They needed tasks. Comfort was a luxury that required safety, and safety was a currency we'd already spent. Fiona Henderson was the first to directly address the briefcase. She was a practical woman with a face built for directness and a manner that suggested she had never in her life employed a euphemism. "What's in the case, Mr. Birch?" "I genuinely don't know." "But you were told to bring it to Arnside." "Yes. By a company that Helen says might have created whatever's turned Margaret Bowen's son into a monster." The word monster landed in the church with physical force. Grace, half hidden behind Lydia, flinched. Lydia put a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "I was told to deliver it," I said. "That's what I know. I'm not defending Blackwell. I'm not defending anyone. I'm a logistics coordinator who was handed something above my clearance, and now I'm here." Arthur intervened with the calm authority of a man who'd spent 40 years delivering diagnoses that ranged from benign to terminal. "The briefcase matters, but it's not our immediate concern. Our immediate concern is that we have 9 people in a village with no reliable communication." He gestured at his phone, which showed no signal. No police presence, and at least one confirmed hostile individual locked in a pantry half a mile away, with potentially more in the surrounding area. "The Arnside facility is 7 miles from here," I said. "If there's someone there waiting for this delivery, they might have answers, resources, communication equipment." Or they might be dead, Helen said. Not cruelty, probability. Then we find out. But staying here with no information and dwindling options isn't a strategy. It's a waiting room. Arthur looked at the group. James Henderson had his arm around Fiona. Lydia held Grace close. Marcus was staring at his useless phone as though willpower might resurrect the network. Helen stood apart, the shotgun resting against the pew beside her, her expression unreadable. We can't all go, Arthur said. We don't have enough vehicles, and moving 9 people through unknown territory is an invitation for disaster. A small group goes to Arnside. The rest fortify here. I'll go, Helen said. I know the coast road. I'm going regardless, I said. It's my delivery. Then I'll stay, Arthur said. Someone with medical knowledge needs to remain with the group. James, Fiona, you'll stay? James nodded. Fiona's jaw was set, her eyes fierce. We'll hold this place. I want to go, said a small voice. Grace Chen, 11 years old, looking up at us from behind her mother's arm. Lydia's grip tightened. Absolutely not, Lydia said. Mum, if they find something important at the facility medicine or a radio or something, and they need someone small to get through a gap or a window. Grace, no. The child fell silent, but her eyes stayed on me, calculating, assessing. She was already thinking 3 moves ahead, and she was right about the windows. And I hated that she was right. Helen and I left Silverdale at 1:30 in the afternoon, taking her Defender because it could handle the coast road's deteriorated surface. I buckled the briefcase into the back seat, the same absurd ritual. The same irrational care for an object whose contents remained a locked mystery. Helen drove. I navigated using a paper ordnance survey map that Arthur had produced from the church vestry. Because satellite navigation had died with the mobile networks, the coast road skirted the edge of Morecambe Bay, a vast tidal flat that shifted between land and sea, according to ancient, indifferent rhythms. At low tide, the bay was a desert of wet sand and channels, treacherous with quicksand that had killed the unwary for centuries. Cocklepickers had drowned here. Walkers had misjudged the incoming tide and been swallowed. The bay had its own relationship with death, older and more patient than whatever new predator was reorganizing civilization 30 miles south. Tell me about the prion research, I said as Helen navigated a hairpin turn above the shore. She kept her eyes on the road. Prions are misfolded proteins. They cause other proteins to misfold. It's like a corruption that spreads through contact. CJD in humans, BSE in cattle, scrapie in sheep. They're terrifying because they're not alive. You can't kill what isn't alive. You can only contain it. And Blackwell was interested in this. Blackwell funded a study into synthetic prion analogs, engineered proteins that could theoretically modify behavior rather than just destroy neural tissue. The pitch was pharmaceutical. Imagine treating severe psychosis by refolding the proteins associated with violent impulse. Imagine treating addiction by restructuring the neural pathways that encode craving. It was elegant on paper. And off paper? Off paper, the animal trials produced subjects that didn't die and didn't recover. They entered a third state, responsive to stimuli but absent of recognition. Aggressive when provoked. But the aggression wasn't defensive. It was acquisitive. They wanted to spread. The behavior mimicked viral transmission strategies, except it was protein-driven. Bite, transfer, convert. The subjects became vectors. I watched the bay through the passenger window. The tide was out. Miles of sand stretched to the horizon, sculpted by water into ridges and pools that caught the gray sky. It looked like the surface of another planet. When you say Blackwell buried the research, they didn't just bury it. They made me sign a non-disclosure agreement that could have bankrupted me. They took the samples. They took my data. They reassigned the lab space and told the university the funding had been redirected to oncology research. And then, 6 months later, they opened a new facility. Arnside. The facility appeared after another 20 minutes of driving. It sat at the end of a gravel track, beyond a gate that was closed but not locked. The building was exactly as I remembered from my stock audit 3 years earlier, a long, low warehouse structure with corrugated metal walls and a flat roof, surrounded by a chain-link perimeter fence. Behind it, salt marshes extended to the bay's edge, and beyond that, the open water of the Irish Sea caught whatever pale light the clouds permitted. But there were additions since my last visit. A second building had been constructed beside the original warehouse, smaller, windowless, with a ventilation system on its roof that looked industrial grade. The car park held 4 vehicles, 2 white vans with no markings, a black Range Rover, and an ambulance. The ambulance's rear doors were open, and I could see equipment inside, not standard paramedic gear, but cases and containers with hazard symbols. "They've been busy," Helen said. We sat in the Defender at the gate for a full minute, watching. No movement, no sound except the wind off the bay and the distant calls of oyster catchers working the tidal flats. "If this is where it started," Helen said slowly, "then driving in is either the bravest or the stupidest thing we could do." "Gerald told me someone would meet me here." "Gerald told you a lot of things 6 hours before civilization started disassembling itself. Gerald's credibility is not robust." She was right. But the briefcase was in the back seat, and the combination was supposedly inside that facility. And whatever answers existed about the disease, about Blackwell, about what was happening to every person south of us, they were behind those corrugated walls. I opened the car door. Helen picked up her shotgun. The main warehouse door was unlocked. Not forced unlocked with a key card. The green light still glowing on the access panel. Inside, the space was divided into sections by floor-to-ceiling plastic sheeting that created corridors and chambers, transforming what had been an open storage area into something resembling a field laboratory. Strip lights overhead cast a cold, clinical illumination that made every surface look slightly unreal. The first section was storage shelving units stacked with pharmaceutical supplies, labeled in codes I couldn't parse. Helen could. She moved along the shelves, reading labels, her face tightening with each new recognition. Cerebrospinal fluid collection kits, protein extraction equipment, cryogenic storage containers rated for biological samples. She pulled a binder from a shelf and opened it. Trial logs, subject numbers, not names, dosage records, observation notes. She read silently for 30 seconds, and I watched her expression travel from concentration to comprehension to something I can only describe as moral vertigo. "They continued the trials," she said. "After shutting down my research, they continued it here. Different methodology, aerosolized delivery instead of direct injection. They were testing airborne transmission. The implication needed us to need no elaboration. An engineered prion analog designed to spread through bites was a containable nightmare. One designed to spread through air was an extinction protocol. Helen, we need to find whoever's supposed to meet me and get out." She closed the binder and carried it with her. Evidence, I understood. Documentation of what Blackwell had done. The binder was her briefcase. We moved through the plastic corridors into the second section, which housed monitoring equipment screens, recording devices, environmental sensors, Most were still running, displaying data that scrolled in real time. Temperature readings, atmospheric composition, and a series of cameras showing feeds from rooms I hadn't yet entered. On monitor 4, I saw a room with a reinforced glass wall. Behind the glass, a figure stood motionless in the center of the space. A man, middle-aged, wearing a hospital gown. He was facing the camera with the same vacant aperture expression I'd seen on the motorway. Mouth open, eyes directed forward but focused on nothing. His hands hung at his sides, fingers slightly curled. He wasn't moving, but he wasn't still in the way a resting person is still. He was still the way a sensor is still, waiting for input. "They kept subjects here," Helen whispered. "Is the containment intact?" She checked the environmental panels. Negative pressure in the containment wing is holding. The ventilation system is functioning. Whatever's in there is staying in there for now. For now. These systems run on generators. Generators need fuel. Fuel is finite. We moved through a third section, an office space, hastily assembled, with desks and filing cabinets, and a whiteboard covered in diagrams I couldn't interpret. On one desk, a laptop was open, its screen showing an email client. The most recent message, sent at 3:17 a.m. that morning, was from an address within the Blackwell Group. The subject line read, "Criterion breach. Execute Protocol 7. The body of the email was brief. Containment failure confirmed at 02:45 Greenwich Mean Time. Aerosolized agent detected beyond perimeter. Predicted urban saturation. Manchester 0600, Liverpool 0800, London 1400. Arnside facility to transition to archive status. Courier dispatched with Criterion documentation. Await delivery. Ensure chain of custody integrity. All other personnel evacuate to secondary site." I read it twice, then a third time. Each reading added a new layer of understanding that I didn't want. Blackwell had known since 2:45 a.m. The outbreak wasn't an accident. It was a containment failure. The agent had escaped the facility, gone airborne, and by the time Gerald handed me the briefcase, Manchester was already being consumed. And the briefcase, the Criterion documentation, was the record, the proof, the evidence of what had been done and how. "Connor." Helen's voice pulled me back. She was standing at the far end of the office, near a door marked, "Restricted Authorized Personnel Only." The door was ajar. Beyond it, a corridor led to the windowless building I'd seen from outside. "The person you're supposed to meet," she said. "If they're anywhere, they're through there." A sound reached us from beyond the door, not the groaning vacancy of the infected, but something mechanical. A rhythmic beeping, steady and electronic. Medical equipment. Someone alive. Someone connected to monitors. Someone waiting in the restricted wing of a facility that had just been designated an archive for humanity's worst mistake. I gripped the briefcase and walked toward the door. The restricted wing was a different world from the improvised laboratory outside. The walls were poured concrete, the floor sealed epoxy, the lighting recessed and shadowless. It had the feeling of a space designed to survive its occupants, built not for comfort, but for continuity, like a black box in an aircraft. The air tasted filtered, processed, stripped of character. The beeping led us to a room at the corridor's end. Inside, a woman was sitting upright in a hospital bed, connected to an IV drip and a cardiac monitor. She was perhaps 60, with silver-streaked hair pulled back severely, wearing a gray cardigan over a hospital gown. Her face was sharp-featured and alert, her eyes tracking us as we entered with an intelligence that was immediately, almost aggressively apparent. "You're late," she said. "I expected the courier by noon." "Traffic was complicated," I replied. "Civilization collapsed." She didn't smile. "My name is Dr. Evelyn Cross. I designed the Criterion Project. I've been confined to this facility for the past 8 months, since I refused to continue the research and became, in Blackwell's estimation, a liability and an asset simultaneously." Helen stepped forward. "You're the principal investigator. I read your early papers, the ones published under the Blackwell grant before they classified everything. You theorized the protein architecture. And you're Helen Marsh. You replicated my work with animal models and came close enough to the truth that they shut you down." Dr. Cross looked at Helen with something between respect and sorrow. "I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for all of it." "How long have you been a prisoner here?" I asked. "Since December. They couldn't release me, I know too much. They couldn't eliminate me. I'm the only person who understands the agent's full molecular structure, which means I'm the only person who might develop a countermeasure. So they kept me here, comfortable enough to remain cooperative, confined enough to remain controllable." "The briefcase," I said, placing it on the table beside her bed. "I was told you'd open it." Dr. Cross looked at the case with an expression I hadn't expected. Grief. Not anticipation, not relief. Grief, as though the briefcase contained something she'd already mourned. "The combination is my daughter's birthday," she said quietly. 1903-87. March 19th, 1987. Hannah. She lives in Manchester. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. "Lived," Dr. Cross corrected herself. And the self-correction was performed with surgical precision, the kind of emotional accuracy that costs everything. She reached for the combination locks and turned the dials. The latches opened with twin clicks that sounded like bones setting. Inside the briefcase, nestled in foam padding, were 3 items: a hard drive in a protective case, a sealed glass vial containing a pale amber liquid, and a document printed bound, perhaps 40 pages, with a cover sheet stamped Criterion, Complete Synthesis Record and Countermeasure Protocol. "The hard drive contains every file related to the project," Dr. Cross said. "Research data, trial results, internal communications, board directives. It's the evidence. The vial is the base compound for a potential countermeasure, not a cure, not yet, but the foundation for one. It needs a proper laboratory to develop. And the document is my work, the synthesis pathway, the protein architecture, the theoretical framework for reversal." "Why courier it?" Helen asked. "Why not transmit it digitally?" "Because Blackwell's digital systems are compromised. Because the people who authorized this project are currently engaged in destroying every trace of their involvement. Because a physical copy, delivered by an unwitting courier through unofficial channels, is the only format they can't remotely delete." I absorbed the word unwitting and let it pass through me. Gerald hadn't trusted me. He'd chosen me because I was reliable and ignorant. A human delivery system optimized for compliance. "The secondary site," I said. The evacuation email mentioned a secondary site. "Where is it?" "Edinburgh, a Blackwell facility embedded in the university research campus. If the countermeasure has any chance of being developed, it needs to reach Edinburgh. The equipment there, the personnel—" "Edinburgh is 200 miles north," Helen said. "Through whatever's happening out there." "Yes," Dr. Cross said. She unplugged her IV with a practiced motion and swung her legs off the bed. "Which is why we need to leave now, while there's still a road to drive on." We returned to Silverdale at dusk with Dr. Cross in the back seat of the Defender, the briefcase on her lap, her cardiac monitor abandoned in a facility that was already becoming a tomb. The drive back was worse than the drive out, not because of what we encountered, but because of what we didn't. The absence of other vehicles, other people, any sign of organized human response. The coast road was a line drawn through emptiness, and the emptiness had a quality of permanence that settled into my joints like cold. The church was lit with candles when we arrived. Arthur had organized the space with military efficiency. Sleeping areas in the side chapel, a supply station near the vestry, a lookout rotation using the bell tower. James Henderson met us at the door with a cricket bat he'd retrieved from his B&B's games cupboard. And the absurdity of it, the English countryside defending itself with sporting equipment, almost broke something in me. Almost. I introduced Dr. Cross to the group. The introduction was received with the complex mixture of hope and suspicion that defines any encounter with expertise during a crisis. Hope because she might have answers. Suspicion because her answers might include her own culpability. Arthur was the first to engage directly. He sat Dr. Cross down in the vestry, gave her tea from a flask, and began asking questions with the gentle thoroughness of a diagnostician. She answered everything. The research, the containment failure, the timeline of corporate decisions that had prioritized profit over precaution at every single junction. She spoke without self-pity and without deflection. And I watched Arthur's face move through anger, disbelief, and finally a grim, functional acceptance. So there's a possible countermeasure, he said. Possible, theoretical, untested. It needs facilities I don't have here. Edinburgh. Fiona Henderson, who'd been standing in the vestry doorway listening, spoke with the clarity of someone who'd already done the mathematics of survival. You're proposing that some of us drive 200 miles through God knows what to deliver a test tube and a document to a laboratory that might not exist anymore. I'm proposing that doing nothing guarantees a specific outcome, Dr. Cross replied, and that doing something preserves the possibility of a different one. What about us? Marcus asked from the nave. His voice had steadied since the morning. Purposeful work on the village hall's electrical system had given him something to grip. The ones who stay. What happens here? You survive, Helen said. Arthur knows medicine. James and Fiona know the village. Marcus, you've got the hall powered. The church is defensible. The bay is a natural barrier on 3 sides. You hold this position, you ration supplies, you avoid contact with anyone showing symptoms. Symptoms being? Vacant affect, impaired coordination followed by directed aggression, open wounds they don't acknowledge. If someone comes to the door and they don't blink when you shine a light in their eyes, don't open the door. The clinical precision of Helen's description did what all clinical precision does. During catastrophe, it made the unimaginable procedural, transforming nightmare into protocol. I'll go to Edinburgh, I said. It's my delivery. It's been my delivery since this morning. I'm going with you, Helen said. No discussion. I need to go, Dr. Cross added. The countermeasure protocol requires my expertise to implement. The document is comprehensive, but synthesis requires interpretive decisions that can't be written down. 3 people, Arthur said. In one vehicle, 200 miles. 200 miles through territory that's been deteriorating for... I checked my watch. 11 hours. Every hour we wait, the territory gets worse. Lydia Chen had been silent throughout the discussion, standing near the altar with Grace beside her. Now she spoke, and her voice carried the particular steel of a parent who's already made an impossible decision. Grace and I will stay here. Arthur, I'm putting her in your care if anything happens to me. She's smart and she's brave, but she's 11. Mom. Grace, this is not a discussion. The child fell silent again, but when she looked at me, there was something in her expression that wasn't childlike at all. It was recognition of what I was carrying and where I was carrying it and why it mattered. She understood the stakes with the terrible clarity that children sometimes achieve when adults are too frightened to lie convincingly. Come back, Grace said to me. 2 words, the simplest possible sentence, carrying the maximum possible weight. I'll try. We left Silverdale at 9 p.m., driving north in darkness because the coast road had no street lighting and the Defender's headlamps carved a narrow corridor of visibility through the black. Helen drove. Dr. Cross sat in the back with the briefcase and the research binder Helen had taken from the facility. I sat in the passenger seat with the Ordnance Survey map and a torch, plotting a route that avoided motorways and major population centers. The plan was simple, in the way that desperate plans always are. Follow the A6 north through the Lake District, cut east at Penrith to pick up the A66, then north again through Carlisle and across the border into Scotland. Stay on secondary roads, avoid cities, stop only when necessary. Reach Edinburgh by dawn. The first hour passed in tense silence. The road unwound through dark countryside, and the only signs of the wider catastrophe were occasional glows on the horizon, fires, presumably in towns we couldn't see, and a persistent absence of other traffic. Once, we passed a farmhouse with every light blazing and the front door wide open, spilling yellow warmth into the night like a wound. Helen didn't slow down. The aerosolized agent, I said, breaking the silence because the silence was becoming its own kind of threat. If it's airborne, why aren't we infected? Dr. Cross answered from the back seat, her voice measured, academic. Aerosolized transmission requires specific atmospheric conditions, humidity, temperature, particle density. The initial release was concentrated around the facility's ventilation exhaust. Prevailing winds carried it southeast toward Manchester. The concentration diminishes rapidly with distance and dispersal. By the time it reached population centers, the particle density was low enough that infection rates were partial, perhaps 1 in 20 on initial exposure. But those infected individuals then transmitted through fluid contact, which is far more efficient. The airborne release was the spark. The bites are the fire. 1 in 20, Helen said. In Manchester, that's 25,000 people on first exposure. Who each bit others? Who each bit others? Exponential progression. The mathematics of it were almost beautiful in their horror, a clean geometric expansion converting a city into a hive in hours. We reached the outskirts of Kendal at 10 p.m. The town sat in a valley below us, and from the elevated road, we could see it clearly. Streetlights were still functioning in most areas, which gave the town a deceptive normality. But at the southern edge, near the river, a section was dark, a blackout zone that spread across several blocks like a bruise on the grid. And at the boundary between light and dark, things were moving. Helen stopped the Defender on the hill. We sat and watched. The figures below moved in patterns that had no precedent in my understanding of human behavior. Not crowds, not mobs, not panicked evacuees. They moved in loose, drifting formations that occasionally consolidated around a point of interest and then dispersed again. They moved like white blood cells, like antibodies responding to an infection, except they were the infection. And whatever they were consolidating around, I didn't want to identify. We go around, Helen said. There's a track that runs along the east side of the valley. It's rough, but it'll bypass the town. She found the track a farm access route that was more suggestion than road, rutted and muddy from recent rain. The defender handled it, but barely, lurching through potholes that tested the suspension and my vertebrae simultaneously. Dr. Cross gripped the briefcase and said nothing. Her face set in an expression of concentrated endurance. Halfway along the track, our headlamps illuminated a figure standing in the path ahead. Not infected, the posture was wrong for that, upright and deliberate. A young woman, maybe 20, wearing a university hoodie and jeans, waving her arms. Helen stopped. I opened my window. "Please." The woman's voice was ragged, spent. "My name's Sienna Park. I was driving from Lancaster. My car broke down a mile back. There are things in the valley, and I've been walking for an hour, and please, please don't leave me here." I looked at Helen. Helen looked at Dr. Cross. Dr. Cross said, "Check her eyes. Shine the torch." I pointed the torch at Sienna's face. She squinted, flinched, blinked. Rapid pupillary response. Functional discomfort. Human. "Get in," Helen said. Sienna Park was a second-year biomedical sciences student at Lancaster University. She'd been in her flat when her housemate came home from a night shift at the Royal Lancaster Infirmary and attacked their other flatmate in the kitchen. Sienna had escaped through a window, taken her car, and driven north until the engine overheated and died near Kendal. She was shaking when she climbed into the Defender, and she didn't stop shaking for 20 minutes. She sat in the back beside Dr. Cross, who, without comment or ceremony, took Sienna's hand and held it. The gesture was so incongruent with Dr. Cross's clinical demeanor that it startled me. But Sienna's breathing slowed, and her shaking diminished. And something about the contact, the simple mammalian act of grip and warmth, accomplished what no explanation could. We cleared Kendal's periphery and found the A6 north. The road was passable, occasional abandoned vehicles, but enough space to navigate around them. The landscape changed as we climbed toward the Lake District. Dark masses of mountains rose on either side, their outlines barely visible against a sky that held no stars. Cloud cover was total, and the darkness beyond our headlamps was absolute, as though we were driving through an unfinished world where nothing existed until light created it. "How far to Penrith?" Sienna asked. Her voice was small but functional. 40 minutes if the road stays clear," Helen said. "And then?" "East to the A66, north through Carlisle, Scotland by midnight." Sienna processed this. "You're going to Edinburgh." "Why Edinburgh?" I explained. "The briefcase, the countermeasure, the laboratory." Sienna listened with the attentiveness of someone trained to evaluate scientific claims. And when I finished, she asked a question that none of us had raised. "If the countermeasure works, what does it do? Reverse the infection? Kill the infected? What's the mechanism?" Dr. Cross answered carefully. "The agent causes protein misfolding in the prefrontal cortex and limbic system, effectively dismantling the neural substrates of identity, empathy, and self-regulation, while preserving motor function and basic predatory behavior. A countermeasure would need to introduce a corrective folding template, a molecular instruction set that guides the misfolded proteins back toward their original configuration." "Would the person recover?" Silence. Then, "The proteins might refold. The neural architecture might partially restore. But the experiences encoded during the infected period, the things the body did while the mind was absent, those memories would integrate with the recovering consciousness. Recovery wouldn't mean return. It would mean waking up inside the consequences of actions you didn't choose." The moral dimension of the countermeasure opened beneath us like a fissure. A cure that restored awareness to people who'd been converted into predators, who'd bitten, attacked, perhaps killed family members, friends, strangers wasn't salvation. It was a different category of suffering. We develop it anyway, Helen said. Her voice allowed no ambiguity. We develop it because the alternative is permanent. Suffering that includes consciousness is still preferable to suffering that includes extinction. Helen's moral clarity was a fixed point in a rotating landscape. I held on to it. We reached Penrith at 11 p.m. The town was dark, entirely dark. No street lights, no house lights, nothing. A total power failure that had reduced a functioning community to a collection of shapes in the night. Helen navigated by headlamp and memory, finding the A66 junction through streets that were empty except for litter and silence. On the eastern edge of town, we found the road blocked. Not by vehicles or infected by a barricade. Deliberate, constructed. Furniture, timber, a tractor positioned across both lanes. And behind the barricade, torchlight and voices. "Stop the car," said a voice from behind the barricade. Male, authoritative, carrying the accent of the region and the weight of someone who'd appointed himself gatekeeper. Nobody passes without explanation. Helen stopped. A man appeared in the headlamps, climbing over the barricade with a rifle slung across his chest. Behind him, others, 4, 5, 6 figures visible in the torch beams, armed with a mixture of firearms and improvised weapons. "My name's Derek Yates," the man said, approaching Helen's window. "This town is under our protection. Turn around." Derek Yates was a sheep farmer with 200 acres north of Penrith, and a face carved by decades of Cumbrian weather into an expression of permanent, unyielding assessment. He was perhaps 55, thick-necked, broad-shouldered, with hands that could restrain a panicked ewe and, evidently, enforce a territorial perimeter with equal capability. The rifle was a Tikka bolt-action, a deer rifle, legal, well-maintained. The people behind him were a mixture of farmers, tradespeople, and 2 off-duty police constables who'd gravitated toward the most decisive authority available when their institutional chain of command dissolved. "We sealed the town 3 hours ago," Derek explained, standing beside the defender with his arms crossed. "We lost 14 people before we got organized. 14 people, including my brother's wife, who turned after a bite from a stranger who walked into the pub at 6 o'clock this evening and went for the barmaid's throat. So you'll understand that my policy on strangers is not currently flexible." "We're not infected," I said from the passenger seat. "We're passing through. Edinburgh. We have a medical researcher in the car with materials that might lead to a countermeasure. Everyone has a story tonight. Everyone is going somewhere important. The last car that came through had a man in the passenger seat who said he was fine and then bit the constable who leaned in to check. "Check our eyes," Helen said. "Pupil response. The infected don't react to light." Derek produced a torch and examined each of us in turn, me, Helen, Dr. Cross, Sienna. 4 sets of flinching, blinking, functioning human eyes. He grunted. "A countermeasure. You're telling me someone knows how to fix this?" "Someone might know how to begin to fix this, Doctor," Cross said from the back seat. "But only if I reach a laboratory in Edinburgh with these materials intact." "Edinburgh's a long way. Carlisle's between here and there, and Carlisle's gone. We picked up enough radio chatter before the networks collapsed to know that. The army tried to hold the castle as a refugee point. It was overrun by 8 p.m. The information settled over us like ash. Carlisle was our planned route north. Without it, We'd need to divert west through the wilderness of the forest of Thirlmere, or east into the Pennines, adding hours and uncertainty. "There's another way," said a woman who'd climbed the barricade to stand beside Derek. She was younger, mid-20s, lean with a practical ponytail and the posture of someone comfortable outdoors. "I'm Reagan Yates, Derek's daughter. I know the hill tracks. There's a route over the border through Kielder Forest. It's unpaved, rough, but it avoids every population center between here and the Scottish lowlands." "You know this route?" Helen asked. "I've run it. Trail running. 50 miles of forest tracks and military roads left over from the MOD range. It'll take your vehicle, barely, and it comes out near Hawick. From Hawick to Edinburgh is straightforward." "I want to go with you," Reagan said. She looked at her father. "Dad, I need to go." "Like hell you do. If they have something that can stop this, they need someone who knows the route. None of them know Kielder. They'll get lost in the dark and die in a forest, and the countermeasure dies with them." Derek Yates was not a man who negotiated. He was a man who decided. But watching him face his daughter's determination, I saw the architecture of authority meet something it couldn't outbuild, a child's refusal to be protected at the cost of purpose. "You come back," he said. The same words Grace Chen had used in the church, delivered in a deeper register but carrying identical weight. "I'll come back." Derek ordered the barricade opened, a section of fencing pulled aside, just wide enough for the defender. He gripped Reagan's arm as she climbed into the vehicle, a contact that was both farewell and anchor. Then we drove through the gap, and the barricade closed behind us. And Penrith became another place we'd left people we owed a return to. Reagan navigated from the back seat, squeezed between Sienna and Dr. Cross, directing Helen through increasingly narrow roads that climbed into the Pennine foothills. The headlamps showed dry stone walls giving way to forestry fences, then to nothing, just the dark mass of conifers pressing close on both sides. Kielder Forest at midnight was a darkness that had weight. The trees absorbed the headlamps, returning nothing, no reflection, no depth, just a wall of absence that moved as we moved. Reagan's directions were precise and calm, delivered in the clipped cadence of someone who'd memorized terrain through their feet. Left at the burned stump, right where the track forks at the old MOD gate. Straight for 2 miles until the bridge over the reservoir outflow. We crossed into Scotland at 1:17 a.m. There was no sign, no marker. Reagan simply said, "We're over." And the forest continued unchanged, indifferent to the human convention that had drawn a line across its floor. The first sign of trouble came at 2 a.m., near the southern edge of Crake Forest. A tree had fallen across the track, not storm damage, but deliberately felled. The cut was fresh, the sawdust still pale. Someone had blocked this route, and recently. Helen stopped the defender. We sat in the silence, engine idling, headlamps illuminating the fallen trunk and the wall of trees behind it. "Can we go around?" I asked. "Ditch on the left, embankment on the right," Reagan said. "Not without a chainsaw." "Then we move it. 5 of us. We move it." We got out. The night air was cold and pine-scented, and the silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. The 5 of us, me, Helen, Reagan, Sienna, and Dr. Cross, who insisted despite her condition, positioned ourselves along the trunk and pushed. It was heavy, waterlogged, resistant. We pushed until my shoulders burned and my vision spotted. The trunk moved 6 inches, then a foot, then enough to create a gap the defender could squeeze through. As we climbed back into the vehicle, Helen paused. "Listen," From somewhere in the forest, impossible to judge distance among the trees, a sound. Not human, not animal. A vocalization that occupied a frequency between moan and signal, rising and falling in a pattern that suggested neither pain nor communication, but something else entirely. A broadcast, an announcement of presence, transmitted through the dark. "Drive, Doctor," Cross said quietly. Helen drove. The sound faded behind us, absorbed by the forest, but it left a residue in the air that none of us discussed. We emerged from the forest at 3 a.m. onto a paved road that led toward Howick. The town was visible in the valley below, lights on, some of them a partial grid still functioning. We skirted it using Reagan's knowledge of farm tracks and came out on the A7 heading north. The final stretch to Edinburgh was the longest hour of my life. The road was clear but felt watched. The sky began to lighten at the eastern edge. Not sunrise yet, but the promise of it. The gray pre-dawn that turns the world into a pencil sketch. Fields emerged from darkness. Fences, sheep standing in clusters, oblivious. The banality of the Scottish lowlands asserting itself against the night we'd survived. We reached the Edinburgh bypass at 4:30 a.m. The city rose to the north, its skyline visible against the brightening sky, the castle, the spires of the old town. Arthur's Seat crouching on the eastern flank. Some sections were dark, others showed lights. Smoke rose from at least 3 distinct locations. But the city existed. It was wounded, diminished, partially darkened, but it existed. Reagan directed us to the university campus, where Dr. Cross identified the Blackwell facility by its security architecture, a building that looked like a research center from the outside, but had reinforced doors and biometric access panels that suggested a different level of operational security. Dr. Cross entered a code. The door opened. Inside, emergency lighting illuminated a corridor that led to a laboratory intact, powered, equipped. A generator hummed in the basement. The building had been designed for continuity, and it was continuing. Dr. Cross walked to the central lab bench, placed the briefcase on the sterile surface, and opened it. She removed the vial of amber liquid, held it to the light, and examined it with the focus of someone who'd spent 8 months imprisoned for the knowledge necessary to use this precise object. "This will take time," she said. "Weeks, perhaps months. And I'll need help." Sienna stepped forward. "I'm a second-year biomedical sciences student. I learn fast." Dr. Cross looked at her, and something passed between them, a transfer of purpose. A baton handed across generations and disciplines. "Then wash your hands and put on gloves. We start now." Helen set her shotgun against the wall. Reagan found the building's communication equipment and began attempting to establish contact with Penrith, Silverdale, anyone. I stood in the laboratory doorway, holding an empty briefcase, watching 2 women begin the work that might undo what one company's ambition had unleashed. The briefcase was empty. My hands were not. I think about Gerald Erskine sometimes. I wonder if he made it out of the Meridian building, or if the lights still hum above his empty desk. I wonder if he understood what he was handing me that morning, not just a briefcase, but the thread that connected corporate failure to human survival. The physical evidence of a catastrophe authored by quarterly earnings and unchecked ambition. We held Edinburgh. Not the whole city a perimeter, a defended zone, a functioning pocket of civilization anchored by the university and sustained by people who refused to stop being people. Dr. Cross and Sienna worked. Helen organized defenses. Reagan ran messages between survivor groups, her trail runner's endurance repurposed for the most important relay race in human history. Arthur radioed from Silverdale once, on a frequency Reagan found the village was holding. Grace was safe. The countermeasure is not a cure. Dr. Cross was right about that. Recovery means waking inside consequences. It means remembering what your hands did when your mind was absent. It means rebuilding identity from rubble. But rubble is not nothing. Rubble is material. Rubble is a place to start. I delivered the briefcase. That was my job. What came after, that's the work of everyone who's left. Including me, especially me. The hum in the lights is different now. I don't ignore it anymore. I listen, and I build, and I carry what needs carrying. Some weights don't get set down. You just get stronger.